His grandmother rejected every rich woman, then chose the maid. The storm hit without warning, and by the time the lights in the great hall flickered and died, a man worth $4 billion was lying on imported marble, unable to stand, while three women who claimed to love him stood frozen, because not one of them knew what to do next. Only the maid moved. Only the maid knelt beside him in the dark, pressed her hands against his leg, and refused to let go. What none of them realized that night was that this wasn't the first storm that had ever brought these two people together. It wasn't even the second. And by the time the truth came out, an entire family fortune, and an entire family's future, would depend on a promise made beneath an oak tree more than 20 years before any of them had ever heard the name Whitfield. Before we go further, take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and tell me where you're watching from. It truly means a lot to see how far these stories connect with people around the world. Now let's go back to where it all began. Ethan Whitfield had built an empire before he turned 35. Real estate towers in 3 states, a technology division that made venture capitalists nervous just hearing his name, and a net worth that made him a permanent fixture on business magazine covers. He had every material comfort a person could imagine, and yet, on the evening this story truly starts, he sat across from the one woman whose opinion had never once been for sale, his grandmother, Margaret Whitfield, and admitted something he had never said out loud to anyone. "Grandmother," he said quietly, staring out at the lights of downtown Nashville from the terrace of the family estate, "I want you to choose the woman who becomes my wife." Margaret was 84 years old, and she had outlived a husband, buried a son, and raised a grandson who somehow still had a soft heart buried underneath boardrooms and bank statements. She studied him for a long moment before she answered. "You're asking me to make the most important decision of your life. I trust your judgment more than I trust my own. You've never failed this family." She reached over and patted his hand. "Then give me a little time, Ethan. Sometimes the person worth choosing isn't standing where everyone expects to find her." He didn't know yet how true those words would become. Word spread quickly through Nashville society that Margaret Whitfield was searching for a granddaughter-in-law, and within days, 3 women had arranged invitations to the family estate, each of them polished, ambitious, and absolutely certain the position belonged to her. There was Victoria Lane, a socialite whose family owned half the hotels in Memphis, a woman who had already picked out which rooms of the mansion she planned to renovate before she'd even been invited to stay the night. There was Priscilla Hart, the daughter of a shipping magnate, sharp-tongued and calculating, the kind of woman who could recite Ethan's net worth down to the decimal point but couldn't tell you his mother's name. And there was Camille Dupree, quieter than the other two but no less determined, a woman who had spent years studying exactly what it took to become the wife of a billionaire, the way some people study for the bar exam. None of them noticed the 4th woman in the house. Nobody ever does. Her name was Hannah Reeves. She was 26. She had been working at the Whitfield estate for 8 months as part of the household staff. And on the afternoon the 3 contestants arrived in their designer luggage and their rehearsed smiles. Hannah was in the kitchen, quietly preparing a tea service that no one would ever thank her for. "Would anyone like me to pour the tea now, Mrs. Whitfield?" she asked, stepping into the parlor where the women had gathered. Victoria glanced at her the way someone glances at furniture. "I suppose that's what she's paid to do." Margaret Whitfield, however, looked at Hannah a moment longer than anyone else in the room. "Stay right where you are, my dear," the old woman said, surprising everyone, including Hannah herself. Sometimes the people everyone overlooks are the ones worth noticing the most. "Grandmother, what made you say that?" Ethan asked later that evening, still turning the moment over in his mind. "A lifetime of watching people," Margaret said simply, "has taught me that the heart sees what the eyes completely miss." She didn't explain further. She didn't need to, because Margaret Whitfield had already decided that this competition would not be won with charm, or wealth, or a rehearsed answer. It would be won by whoever behaved the same way whether the cameras were on her or not. And she intended to find out exactly who that was, one quiet observation at a time. The first test came the very next morning, and it revealed more in 90 minutes than 3 weeks of polite dinner conversation ever could have. "Your first task is simple," Margaret announced to the 3 women gathered in the kitchen, still in their silk robes, clearly expecting breakfast to be delivered rather than made. "Each of you will prepare breakfast for this house with your own 2 hands." Victoria laughed before she could stop herself. "You want us to cook?" This mansion has professional chefs on staff. Cooking isn't the lesson, Margaret said calmly. Patience is the lesson. Humility is the lesson. Service, without expecting applause in return. That is what I am testing this morning. What followed was, in the words of the household staff who witnessed it, an absolute disaster. Priscilla set off the smoke alarm twice, trying to determine whether butter went into the pan before or after the eggs. Camille quietly considered calling her favorite restaurant to have breakfast delivered and pass it off as her own until she remembered Margaret had specifically instructed that every dish be made personally. Victoria stood in the middle of the chaos, arms crossed, insisting that cooking had absolutely nothing to do with being a good wife, while smoke curled toward the ceiling behind her. And then there was Hannah, not a contestant, simply a member of the household staff going about her normal Tuesday morning, moving through the kitchen with the calm, practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, because she had. She wasn't performing for anyone. She had no idea Margaret was watching from the doorway. "Who taught you to cook with such confidence?" Margaret asked, stepping inside. "My mother," Hannah answered without looking up from the stove. "She always told me that food made with love has a way of healing people before they even take the first bite." When the meal was finally served, burned eggs from one contestant, undercooked bacon from another, and a modest but genuinely warm plate from Hannah, Margaret tasted each one in silence. When she reached Hannah's plate, something in her expression softened. "This doesn't just satisfy hunger," the old woman said quietly. "It reminds me of family, of warmth, of someone who actually cared while making it." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield," Hannah replied. "My mother always believed a meal should leave people feeling loved, not just full." "Never forget those words," Margaret told her. "They reveal more about your heart than anything on this plate." It was a small moment. Nobody in that kitchen understood, in that instant, how much weight it would eventually carry. Over the following days, Margaret began quietly observing every person in her household, the 3 contestants competing loudly for her approval, and the one young woman who wasn't competing for anything at all. She found Hannah in the garden one evening, tending to a bed of flowers that weren't officially part of her duties. "I hope you don't mind me looking after these," Hannah said. "They always seem happier with a little extra attention." "A person who cares for flowers," Margaret said, settling onto a bench nearby, "usually knows how to care for people. That's becoming a rare gift these days." Then, almost casually, she asked the question that had been sitting on her tongue for days. "If Ethan lost every company, every house, and every dollar he owns tomorrow, would you still believe he deserves to be loved?" Hannah didn't hesitate. Money can disappear overnight, but kindness, integrity, and the way a person treats others, those are things no bankruptcy can ever take. Mr. Whitfield has always spoken to every member of this staff with respect. He remembers our names. He thanks us for our work. He treats us like people, not furniture. Losing his fortune would never change the kind of man he is underneath it. Margaret sat with that answer for a long moment before she finally said, "Most people spend their whole lives chasing wealth while completely overlooking the value of a beautiful heart." "A beautiful heart," Hannah said softly, "is worth protecting. It's much harder to find than money." Margaret Whitfield walked back into the house that night, having already made up her mind about several things, though she said nothing to anyone yet. She wanted to see more. She wanted to know if the young woman in the garden was the same young woman when the lights were off and nobody was watching at all. She got her answer sooner than she expected, during a conversation Hannah never knew Margaret had overheard. While the storm clouds were still building outside, unrelated to weather, a very different kind of storm was forming inside the mansion, and it had nothing to do with romance. It had to do with money, the same subject that had quietly poisoned every conversation among the 3 contestants from the moment they'd arrived. "For a billionaire's mansion," Camille had remarked one afternoon, wandering the halls, "I honestly expected something bigger. I'd probably renovate almost everything after the wedding." She'd already estimated, out loud, that the estate alone was worth several $1,000,000 before the farms, the hotels, and the international holdings were even factored in. "The fortune is impressive," she added, "but what really matters is how much of it becomes legally mine." Victoria, not to be outdone, had her own plans. "The very first thing I'm buying is a private island, somewhere only the wealthiest people in the world are allowed to visit. I'd rather own a controlling share of Whitfield Holdings, Priscilla countered coolly. Real power comes from business, not beaches. Give me 5 years of marriage, and I'll walk away with half of everything Ethan owns, whether the marriage lasts or not. None of them realized Margaret had paused just outside the doorway, listening to every word. It's heartbreaking, the old woman murmured to herself as she walked away. How quickly greed reveals itself the moment people believe no one is listening. And here's the thing about greed, it rarely stays quiet for long. If you've ever watched someone show their true colors the second they thought nobody was paying attention, drop a yes in the comments right now, because this story is about to prove exactly how far that kind of person will go. What none of the three women knew, what none of them could have known, was that the greed already circling the Whitfield fortune wasn't limited to the women hoping to marry into it. There was someone else in the house with far more dangerous intentions, and he had been waiting patiently for his opportunity for a very long time. His name was Derek Voss. He was Ethan's second cousin, a senior executive at Whitfield Holdings, and for years he had quietly resented standing in the shadow of a younger relative who had built an empire Derek believed should have belonged to him. While Ethan spent his time chasing love and taking advice from an old woman, Derek had been busy with something far less sentimental: restructuring board documents, shifting ownership percentages, preparing a stack of paperwork that, if signed without careful reading, would transfer controlling interest of Whitfield Holdings directly into his own hands. Make sure every transfer is finalized before the board meeting, Derek instructed his assistant one evening, his voice low, his eyes cold. Once Ethan signs these papers, the company belongs to me, and he won't even realize it happened. Are you certain he won't notice the changes, sir? Derek allowed himself a thin smile. Ethan, he corrected himself quickly, has become distracted. Family, marriage, emotions. Distracted men never notice the knife until it's already in their backs. It was a line he would come to regret, though not nearly as quickly as he deserved to. The storm arrived 3 nights later, and it arrived without mercy. Sheets of rain hammering against the windows, thunder rattling the chandeliers, and somewhere in the middle of it, the entire estate lost power. The backup generators, expensive as they were, took several long minutes to kick in, and in the chaos and the darkness, Ethan Whitfield lost his footing on the marble staircase and went down hard, his leg twisting beneath him with a sound that made everyone in the room go still. What happened in the next 60 seconds told Margaret Whitfield everything she still needed to know. Victoria stood frozen in the doorway, more concerned about whether the imported marble had cracked than about the man lying injured on top of it. Priscilla scrambled for her phone, only to realize there was no signal, and stood there uselessly repeating that someone needed to call for help. Camille didn't move at all. Hannah moved before any of them. She was on the ground beside Ethan in seconds, her hands steady despite the darkness, her voice calm despite the panic all around her. Please stay still, she told him. Moving too quickly will only make it worse. I think I twisted my leg, Ethan managed through clenched teeth. Lean on me slowly. I'm not going anywhere. She examined the injury with careful hands. I don't think it's broken, but it's already swelling. I'll get ice, bandages, and something for the pain, now. She was gone and back again in what felt like moments, moving through the dark hallways of a house she didn't own with more confidence than the women who hoped to inherit it. Thank you, Clara, Ethan whispered, catching himself. Hannah. Thank you, Hannah. You reacted before anyone else even understood what had happened. Anyone would have done the same, she said quietly. Margaret Whitfield, watching from the top of the staircase, shook her head slowly. No, my dear, she murmured, mostly to herself. Not everyone would have. If you've made it this far, you already know this story is heading somewhere unexpected, and I'd love to know. Do you think Margaret already knew who she was going to choose? Type 1 if you think she already knew, or 2 if you think something is about to change her mind completely. The morning after the storm, with Ethan resting his injured leg upstairs, an unexpected visitor arrived at the estate, and Hannah was the one who answered the door. Good afternoon, Mr. Voss, she said politely. Mr. Whitfield is currently resting. He injured his leg during the storm last night. That's perfectly fine, Derek said, stepping past her into the foyer uninvited. I'll wait for him. He studied her for a long moment, the way a predator studies something it's already decided to hunt. You must be Hannah. I've heard quite a lot about the young woman who's suddenly become very important around this house. Is there something you need, sir? Actually, Derek said, lowering his voice, glancing around to make sure no one else was in earshot. I wanted to speak with you first. Ethan trusts you more than most people in this house these days. And that kind of trust, that's extremely valuable. Hannah felt something cold settle in her stomach. I'm not sure I understand what you're trying to say. All I need, Derek said smoothly, is for you to encourage Ethan to sign a few routine business documents without asking too many questions. Do that for me, and I'll make sure you never have to work as a maid again for the rest of your life. For a moment, the offer hung in the air between them. Enough money, enough freedom, enough of an escape from a life of scrubbing floors and pouring tea for people who barely acknowledged her existence. That most people would have at least considered it. Hannah didn't blink. Are you asking me to betray the man who has always treated me with kindness? I prefer to call it taking advantage of an opportunity, Derek said. Opportunities like this don't come twice. Integrity isn't something I sell, Mr. Voss. No matter how much money is offered. Everyone has a price. You don't know everyone as well as you think you do, Hannah said evenly. Some people would rather sleep peacefully with an honest heart than live comfortably with a guilty conscience. Derek's expression hardened. You're making a very expensive mistake. No, Hannah replied, standing her ground. The expensive mistake would be losing my self-respect for money that was never mine to take. You really believe he'll reward your loyalty forever? I'm not loyal because I expect a reward. I'm loyal because that's the kind of person my parents raised me to be. You'll regret refusing me, Derek said, his voice dropping to something closer to a threat. When everything falls apart in this family, remember, I gave you a chance to stand on the winning side. Hannah looked him directly in the eye, unflinching. The winning side is always the side that lets you look at yourself in the mirror without shame. Money can tempt the hands, Mr. Voss, but it can never purchase a clean conscience. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the foyer, and she never mentioned the conversation to another living soul, not out of fear, but because she genuinely believed it wasn't worth repeating. What she didn't know was that Margaret Whitfield had been standing just around the corner, close enough to hear every single word. By the time the decision day finally arrived, Margaret had watched enough. She gathered the 3 contestants, along with Ethan, into the grand parlor of the estate, the same room where this entire competition had begun. Thank you all for coming, Margaret began. After watching each of you carefully these past few days, I've finally reached my decision. But before I announce it, I want to ask each of you one final question, because your answer may reveal more than anything you've shown me until now. Ask me anything, Victoria said confidently. If Ethan lost every company, every investment, and every dollar he owns tomorrow, would you still marry him? Victoria hesitated, clearly caught off guard. Well, I suppose we'd have to discuss what our future would realistically look like before making such a life-changing decision. Marriage should involve stability. I don't think anyone would willingly choose a life of financial uncertainty. Priscilla's answer wasn't much different, dressed up in slightly kinder language, but carrying the exact same hesitation underneath. Camille said almost nothing at all, which, in its own way, said everything. Then Margaret did something none of them expected. Hannah, she said, would you please come here? The room went silent. Hannah stepped forward, confused. Did you need something, Mrs. Whitfield? I'm asking you the very same question, because your answer matters just as much as theirs. Margaret's eyes were steady. If Ethan lost everything he owns today and had nothing left except his character, would you still stand beside him? Hannah didn't need a single second to think it over. A person's value has never been measured by the size of a bank account, she said. If a good man loses his money, he can build it again. But if he loses his character, he's already lost everything that matters. Mr. Whitfield has always treated me, and every member of this staff, with respect. So whether he owns 10 companies or nothing at all, he'll still be the same man I've always admired. Silence swept through the room. That, Margaret said quietly, is exactly the answer I have spent my entire life hoping my grandson would one day hear. She's only saying that to impress everyone. Victoria snapped, unable to hide her irritation. I wasn't trying to impress anyone, Hannah said calmly. You asked me for the truth. That's the only thing I know how to give. She's a maid, Mrs. Whitfield, Priscilla said sharply. This competition was never meant for someone like her. With all due respect, she doesn't belong in this conversation at all. Enough, Margaret said, her voice cutting through the room with a firmness none of them had heard from her before. I've listened to all of you long enough to know exactly who belongs in this family, and who does not. She turned and, for the first time, looked directly at her grandson. The woman who truly deserves your heart, Ethan, is not standing among the 3 women who came here seeking your fortune. She paused. The woman I choose is Hannah Reeves. This is the moment everyone's been waiting for. But before we get to what happens next, if this story has you holding your breath right now, hit that like button. It helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Chaos broke out almost instantly. Mrs. Whitfield, there must be some mistake, Hannah stammered, stepping back. I'm only the housemaid. This is absolutely ridiculous, Victoria said. She wasn't even one of the contestants. How can a maid possibly become part of the Whitfield family? After everything we've done, you're choosing a servant over us? Priscilla demanded. I didn't choose a servant, Margaret said, unshaken. I chose the only woman in this house who consistently placed Ethan's well-being above her own interests. I watched every one of you when you believed no one was paying attention. And while 3 of you spent your time asking what Ethan could give you, this young woman quietly showed me everything she was willing to give him, without ever expecting anything in return. Ethan crossed the room and stood in front of Hannah, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something far gentler. My grandmother has placed an incredible amount of trust in you, he said. But before anyone says another word, I want to hear what your own heart has to say. Mr. Whitfield, Hannah said, her voice trembling slightly. I never expected any of this. I came here to work, not to become part of your family. Then tell me honestly, Ethan said, stepping closer. Is there even the smallest chance we could have a future together? Hannah took a breath. Before I answer that, there's something I've carried in my heart for a very long time, and I think you deserve to finally know the truth. Whatever it is, Ethan said gently, you don't have to be afraid to tell me. Long before I ever became a maid in this house, Mr. Whitfield, she said slowly, my mother worked for your parents. I was just a little girl. Ethan blinked, confused. My parents employed your mother? Every school holiday, she used to bring me here because she had no one to leave me with. While she worked, I spent my afternoons playing in the garden, the one behind the east wing, near the old oak tree. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, a memory surfacing from somewhere far beneath the surface of decades. Wait, he said slowly. Are you talking about the little girl who used to sit beneath that oak tree with a basket of sandwiches? Yes, Hannah said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. And every afternoon, you would sneak away from your tutors just long enough to share lunch with me before anyone noticed you were gone. You can't be serious. You used to complain that everyone treated you like the son of a billionaire instead of just letting you be an ordinary boy, she said. You told me once that you wished someone would become your friend without caring about your family name. You were the one who gave me half of your lunch, Ethan said, his voice catching, the memory rushing back all at once. Even though your mother had packed so little for you, you always insisted on sharing yours with me anyway, Hannah said, smiling through tears now. You said food tasted better when no one had to eat alone. I searched for you, Ethan said. After you stopped coming, no one could ever tell me where you'd gone. My father passed away unexpectedly, Hannah explained softly. My mother moved us away to start over, because staying here reminded her too much of everything we'd lost. All these years, Ethan said, shaking his head in disbelief. You've been the one person I never forgot. I never forgot you either, she admitted. But I never wanted you to think I stayed close because of your money. So I kept my distance. I did my work. I never said a word. All this time, Ethan whispered, you've been serving tea in my own house, while I spent years searching the world for someone whose kindness reminded me of a little girl I once knew beneath an oak tree. The room around them had gone completely silent. Victoria, Priscilla, and Camille stood frozen, their carefully rehearsed ambitions suddenly meaningless in the face of something none of them had ever bothered to understand. That the truest connections are rarely built on convenience and almost never built on money. Margaret Whitfield watched her grandson take Hannah's hand in front of everyone, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to cry. The days that followed brought their own quiet justice. When board members reviewed the paperwork Derek Voss had quietly prepared, the attempted transfer of company shares was uncovered within hours. Ethan's legal team had flagged irregularities the moment Hannah, unprompted, mentioned the strange conversation Derek had tried to have with her at the front door. Derek was removed from the company entirely, his name quietly erased from a legacy he had never truly earned. A stark reminder that greed dressed up in a tailored suit is still greed, and it rarely survives contact with the truth. Victoria, Priscilla, and Camille each left the estate within the week, their bags packed with far more than they had arrived with and far less dignity than they'd hoped to leave behind. None of them ever spoke to the Whitfield family again. Hannah Reeves, the young woman who had once been overlooked by everyone in that room except the one person whose opinion mattered most, married Ethan Whitfield the following spring in a small, quiet ceremony beneath, of course, an old oak tree, the very one where two children had once shared a single basket of sandwiches without knowing what the future held for either of them. Margaret Whitfield sat in the front row that day, 85 years old, watching the granddaughter-in-law she had chosen not for her name, not for her wealth, but for the quiet, unshakable goodness she had carried through every single test, the ones she knew about, and the ones she never realized she'd been taking at all. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If you were in Margaret's position, watching everyone in that room, deciding who truly deserved to be part of the family, do you think you would have noticed Hannah the way she did? Let me know in the comments, because I read every single one, and it genuinely means the world to hear which part of this story stayed with you the longest. There's a lesson in this story that's easy to say and much harder to actually live by. Character reveals itself in the moments no one is watching. It's easy to be kind when there's an audience. It's easy to be generous when there's something to gain. But the people truly worth keeping in your life are the ones who show up the same way in the dark as they do in the light, who kneel down beside you when the power goes out, who tell the truth even when a lie would be easier, and who choose integrity over an easier, richer path every single time. Hannah Reeves never set out to become part of the Whitfield family. She never schemed for it, never asked for it, never even wanted it. She simply chose, over and over again, to be exactly who her mother raised her to be, and in the end, that was worth more than every fortune the other women in that room had ever dreamed of inheriting. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it moved you even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment telling me what stayed with you, and subscribe to Untold Maid Confessions so you never miss the next story like this one. New stories go up every week. Real, emotional stories about the people who show up when the rest of the world looks away. Until next time, take care of your heart, and take care of the people who quietly take care of you.